Welcome everyone to session 4, action and expression that honors variability. Yay! And let me turn it over to our webinar hosts.
Thanks, Nicole. Like Nicole mentioned, thank you so much for joining us for session 4. Excited about it and also sad mixed feelings because it means that we're ending this series. But friendly reminder, I'm Janelle Mercado, project coordinator with the Supporting Inclusive Practices Project out of El Dorado County Office of Education. My co-host for this series, joining me again today, is Juliet Anyanwu, our SIP program support specialist. And on behalf of our team, we'd like to thank you all for being with us this afternoon. As a friendly reminder, all session materials, including the certificate of completion and sessions recordings 1 through 3, can be found on our resource Padlet. Today's presentation is also being recorded and will be uploaded as soon as possible. Closed captioning has been enabled, so please access it as needed. The SIP team is here to support you in the chat. And again, we will host a Q&A with our presenters at the end of today's session. So please put any questions that you have in the chat and we will capture them as we navigate today's session. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Nicole Tucker Smith and Sylvia Rodriguez Douglas to lead us through a powerful conversation about how action and expression honors variability.
Yes, thank you so much. I am excited for today, a little bit sad, but really, actually, it's the end of this format. But what I'm excited about is just how many people have showed up and then are willing to take the work and move it forward. So again, reminder, my name is Nicole Tucker Smith. You have access to my bio. Sylvia, do you want to say anything to the folks before we jump into content?
Yeah, I'm just so grateful. I'm feeling gratitude, deep gratitude as we wrap up just this series. And for all the folks who have been showing up and returning, and whether you're new today or been to each and every one session or anywhere in between, just know we're so grateful for you and we wouldn't be here without you. So thank you for dedicating your time, your space, your energy to this work. We're just really honored to be in your company.
And today we're talking about elevating UDL 3.0 for every learner, And we're focusing specifically on the principle of action and expression and on this concept of how do we honor variability. Remembering that variability is a gift and not a barrier. The fact that learners are variable is not a problem, but an opportunity. So how do we support action and expression in a way that honors that variability? Now, you already saw the link, or you already had access to the link to the Padlet of resources. On that Padlet of resources, you also have access to our session materials. It has been updated for all the sessions are on the one document there. If you go to bit.ly SIP UDL3, if you go there, all the materials, you can refresh if you were there last week, and you can access all of the materials, including the UDL 3.0 design canvas. And we're going to be highlighting a lot of the resources from there today. So just as a reminder, our series goal is to offer concrete steps, considerations, and resources. Today we're going to be talking about a lot of tools, resources, and strategies in order to leverage UDL 3.0 in designing equitable environments so that every learner can thrive, not just be there, right? Not just be invited to the dance or asked to the dance, but having an opportunity to choose the music. And we've focused our conversations first with session 1, really looking at the updated goal of UDL, which is learner agency that is purposeful and reflective, resourceful and authentic, strategic and action-oriented. We focused on the principle of designing multiple means of engagement for session 2, representation for session 3, and today we're really focusing on the third column, the third principle, action and expression. That said, even though there are 3 principles and 9 guidelines, and they kind of show up in a box, right? In columns and boxes, they actually work together. And last time we talked about how representation can really work to reduce bias and help us to act in a way that we can choose empathy, really try to overcome that empathy gap. Today, we want to talk about how the neural networks work together to support action and learner agency. And one way that we can understand how the brain works and how these neural networks work together is to focus on this idea of hope. When we feel hopeful, this is the part of our brain that is activated. It's called the rostral anterior cingulate cortex. And if you look at, or if you are able to perceive this image here, you'll notice that this area of the brain is where our limbic system, or our affective networks, the affective networks that are part of, aligned to our multiple means of engagement, it's where our affective networks overlap with our strategic networks. These are the strategic networks that align with multiple means of action and expression. And actually, if you're really, really a UDL nerd, you might notice that this graphic for the affective networks has actually been updated, because it didn't necessarily have this part in this little tip here. That there's an extra part that is shaded to show how the affective networks actually overlap with the prefrontal cortex, with the strategic networks, because it includes this space right here that lights up when we feel hopeful. So here's what that means for us as human beings. When we are hopeful, that is when our emotions can affect our actions, and it's when our actions influence our emotions. It's that reason why, even if you don't feel like smiling, okay, I'll just tell you, I was at a school district today, and I was working with somebody, and I said, oh, your smile just lights up the room. And she was having an honest moment with me, and she said, it's a fake smile today. And I said, well, you know what? Even a fake smile makes a difference. Even if it's fake, the act of smiling can influence your mood, partly because it also influences the mood of other people around you, and then they smile back. And so this idea of how our actions can affect our emotions, and our emotions can affect our actions, this is how we can actually choose hope. And a huge part of learner agency is this belief of self-efficacy, this belief that if I put in the work and the effort, it can make a difference. Do I have something to hope for? And do I believe that I can get there? Even with help, we can get there. And so I like to highlight how all of the neural networks, even though they show up in columns, they all work together and they influence one another. And so just for the point of conversation, we're going to take 90 minutes to talk about how action and expression can honor variability. So we're going to focus on this column, but absolutely, when we look at options for action and expression, it's going to influence engagement. It's going to influence the sense of, I can be effective here, I can be successful here, I can be hopeful here. And so the question or one of the questions we're going to address is, how might UDL 3.0 help to honor variability? And we're even going to be more specific. We're going to talk about action expression, but let's talk specifically about this idea of student participation. So often I hear that a main frustration of educators is that students don't seem to necessarily be as engaged as we would like for them to be. And part of that is related to how we offer options around participation. That's how engagement, action, expression, they work together. So let's think about this idea of participation. How can we honor variability as it relates to student participation? And I just, some of you who've heard me speak before, I often have mentioned how a lot of our classrooms, a lot of our educational settings tend to prioritize extroverts. If you're an extrovert, if you're willing to put yourself out there, be the first one to speak, the fastest one with your hand up, you're seen as, oh, the smartest, the quickest, the one who has the answers, and you almost get a confidence boost. And sometimes I'll even hear educators say, well, I wish they weren't so shy. I wish they were less shy. But the world needs shy people, right? And shyness is an aspect of variability. It's not a deficit.
Mm.
And so if we're going to think about how we might honor variability in student participation, if you've been with me for the first three, we're going to flip it. Or Sylvia, want to ask something or say something before we ask this question?
No, you mentioned a couple of things that I think are worth elevating. The first is that you were kind of leading into like, what is it that we typically value in educational settings? And certainly being extroverted, you mentioned also being verbal and also being quick. So speed with which you respond is also, think of Jeopardy, right? Like the speed, that's how you win points, is you go fast and you answer quickly. And you have to, the world does need more shy people, right? The introverted, the folks who are deep thinkers, who take their time to warm up. That's my daughter for sure. And she is observant and takes it all in. And that's part of her variability that I see as a gift that she brings to a space.
Yes, yes. And so if we think about what we tend to prioritize and elevate, now let's think about, we always ask that flip side question. So if we want to think about how we can better support participation, let's think about it now, because barriers are in the environment, not the learner. Let's think about, what are we doing? When do schools limit student interaction in the classroom and participation? So take a moment and feel free to add in the chat, but think about it. Maybe you think about your own experience as a student. Or maybe you're picturing a classroom that you've been to recently, your classroom, someone else in your school or your district. But when do we, as educators, or in the design of the environment, limit student interaction and participation? And I'm going to make a mental note. As I'm doing this, I'm also being quiet so that I'm giving you a chance to participate.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Mm. Ooh.
Oh, and if we can add the link in the chat to the slides, or we don't have the link to the slides, but the link to the Google Doc.
To the Padlet and the resources. And there's a lot of really rich ideas coming in the chat right now.
So many.
Yeah.
So many ideas around, this is the acceptable way to participate, and there's only one way. Eye contact, quiet hands, raise your hand. That's it.
English only, right?
English only.
Someone mentioned when we honor variability, that really creates a ton of barriers for those who use assistive technology or who use other forms of communication, right? It's immediately discounting what they have to offer.
I love the limited think time too. And
Mm.
I've had to, like, even when I'm working with workshops, say, we're going to take time to just be quiet so that we have think time. Some of us need more think time, and that's okay.
Mm.
Yeah, and I love this idea of, a lot of classrooms are set up where it's the sage on the stage. That's going to limit interaction.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, certainly how the classroom is organized, right? Where students are seated.
I love this. When you hear crickets, and then go ahead and answer.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah, I know that. I mean, I understand that sometimes silence can be uncomfortable, right? But it's in those moments of silence that I think we provide opportunity for folks to really process, to slow down, to maybe revisit the question or the content, whatever it is, just to slow things down.
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about time today.
Mm-hmm.
Time is a huge part of honoring variability.
Ooh, I love this one. We're going like jumping into correcting a student rather than prompting them to dig a little deeper. Yeah, who's who's uncomfortable with the silence? Is it us or the students?
Is it
That's a good.
honestly, when we're silent, they're thinking,
Mhm,
you
mhm.
know, sometimes you need silence to be like, oh, wait a minute, I should be paying attention. You know, like,
Yes, totally.
yes, anytime a teacher talks when the student could have done the talking, right? When we, there's a great, saying by Spencer Kagan, if you want them to hear it, you talk. If you want them to learn it, they talk.
Mhm.
And talk can have talk is a framing, but can mean a variety of things,
Right,
right?
not just verbal talking is what you're saying, right?
Mhm,
More
mhm.
expansive definition of talking.
Yes,
Yeah.
talk is an expansive definition. And I don't know what my background, your background is in supporting special education. Mine is more general education side, but it would often really, we need a better word for when we describe students as nonverbal. They're not nonverbal. They might not be speaking in a traditional sense, but they have so many thoughts that can be expressed if we use technology options. As one example is, text to speech or other AAC devices.
Right, right.
Yeah. So we jotted a few down, Sylvia and your list is very impressive.
Mhm.
And some of this is overlap, but having only one way to participate, prioritizing some forms of expression over others. And we can also say prioritizing speed, right, over the youth advisory board, when we were updating UDL 3.0 guidelines, we had several students who use communication devices, augmentative, alternative communication devices. And it requires time. On our side, we had to provide the information in advance. We had to allow time for them to be able to fully communicate. But you know what? That was nice. The slowing down and the thinking and the thoughtfulness was worth it.
Yeah.
Because so many times we're trying to cram and cover, but pausing allows students to uncover. And we remember and understand deeply when we uncover. If we cover, they'll learn it maybe for the test. But if they discover it and uncover it for themselves, they'll learn it for more of a lifetime, or at least for, the next grade.
Has a better chance, right?
Also, low expectations. Who do you expect to participate? Right? So expectations can play a part of that. And then here's one we're going to talk about today, this idea of routines. Inconsistent or lack of routines can stifle student participation and interaction because they're trying to figure out what's permitted, what's safe, who am I allowed to be in this space? I'm unsure because of the inconsistency. Anything else, Sylvia? What else do you think? Anything else about that we may
You know,
have
I
missed?
just do want to uplift something that came to the chat in response to your comment about the term nonverbal. Thank you so much, Paula, for sharing that your son your son's team uses the term multimodal communicator. I think that is so beautiful. So let's
I
spread.
love that.
I love that.
We all work on spreading that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing, Paula.
Because I have really been struggling. It hurts my heart to use the words that to me don't fully embrace
Mm-hmm. So focused on the deficit, right?
learning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Multimodal. I love it. Yay. That's why I love these.
Yeah.
We have like 100 thinkers more. And so as we talk about some strategies, some processes, some routines that support student interaction and participation, we have to lift up and remind ourselves, we've said it before, but there's a core idea that barriers are in the environment, or another way to think about it, barriers are in the design, like the lesson design, the instructional design, not the learners. So how do we apply UDL in a proactive way, an intentional way to remove barriers that don't have to be there? And so UDL is a, a proactive process, and we're just going to repeat it over and over. You start with what's the goal? And we intentionally consider who is most likely to be marginalized. Who is most likely going to find themselves on the edges of this learning experience? Let's take a moment and empathize with them, or maybe even co-design with them, and consider what barriers may need to be removed for learners to achieve the goal, for learners to get there. And barriers are like, I was working with some teachers, and this one teacher, he's like, oh, I get it now. Barriers are like potholes. You're not a better driver because you know how to dodge potholes. They're just annoying. They're in the way, and sometimes they mess up your tires, right? I'm not engaging in rigor because I'm dodging a pothole, right? If I want to get to the goal, my goal is to get to the goal, is not to dodge potholes. And so can we, get rid of some of those potholes so the students can drive safely, competently, confidently to their learning destination? And as we think about removing barriers, whether that's through scaffolds or supports or options, consider making those supports available to everyone. As long as those supports do not change the rigor of the goal, make them available to everyone, because it removes the stigma of needing the accommodation in the first place. And it helps learners learn how to navigate to what they need. And you never know, if it's just removing a barrier, it's not reducing the rigor. If it's removing a barrier, you don't actually know who's going to benefit. We have to give up this idea that we know what everybody needs, right?
Right. And if anything, this supports the notion of learner agency, right? When you make those options available to everyone, then the onus is on the learner to make the choices that they feel are in their best interest and in service of that meaningful learning goal.
Yes. Yes. And so sometimes teachers have a struggle with this idea of making something available to everyone, because they'll say, well, I don't want to make it too easy. And a lot of times we have confused rigor with what I call rigor mortis. We're just stuck in our ways. We're stiff and stuck. And no, rigor should not be confused with rigor mortis. And so here's another way to think about this concept of barriers. What do we mean by removing barriers? There's productive struggle, and then there's unproductive struggle. Productive struggle is a good thing. It is effort for learning that develops creative problem solving related to the learning goal. Unproductive struggle are those unnecessary barriers that are not in service of the learning goal. It's often due to inflexibility. It's like that because, there's only one way, because that's the way we've always done it. That might be the way that's most convenient in terms of speed. But it's not in service of the goal. Productive struggle, we want that. And in fact, routines are required for students to feel safe enough for productive struggle. But those unnecessary barriers, those are forms of unproductive struggle. And if we dig a little bit deeper to think about this concept of barriers and not confuse it with variability. Sylvie, do you want to take this one on how there's variability and then there's barriers?
So with UDL, Nicole has stated this over and over again, and it's worth repeating, that variability is a good thing, right? It is what adds to the richness of the tapestry of our classrooms, right? When we bring in diverse perspectives, we bring in diverse strengths, challenges, all of that, right? But sometimes we've noticed when we work with educators that they'll confuse variability with barriers. They'll think that, oh, a student's diagnosis or a student's cultural background poses a barrier to reaching a goal. When in fact, as Nicole said, the barrier doesn't live in the student, it's actually in the design. So just to kind of tease that out a little bit more, I wanted to provide some examples of how we might turn a variability into a barrier which we can do something about, right? The barriers, when we identify the barriers, we can design for them. So an element of variability might be that the student speaks a language other than English at home, right? That is not a deficit. That is not something to try to navigate around. The barrier might be when the content is only presented in English. That is a barrier for getting that student and probably a range of students access to the goal and the content. Another example might be, okay, I have a student who has ADHD and attending to the speaker is a real challenge, right? That's the barrier. No. The fact that your student has ADHD is not a barrier, right? The fact that they might have to sit for 30 minutes to listen to a lecture or a student presentation, that's a barrier, right? And that's something we can do about. That's something we can design for. Similarly, okay, I have a student who is dyslexic and is reading multiple grade levels below their peers. Okay, that happens. That's part of the natural variability, right? The barrier is that really that students only have access to printed text, right? If we allow for multiple means and allow that student to be able to read through audio text or a range of text, then we can really open up the possibilities and create access points. So if you notice all the barriers on the right-hand side, there's something we can do with them. The variability is the variability. There's nothing we can change about that. That's how students come to us. We're not trying to fix them. But the barriers that they might find in the environment are things that we can design for. So I hope that's a helpful clarification.
And part of it is just, it's a daily practice, right? It's daily practice. There will be days where you're like, oh my gosh, these students XYZ.
Yeah.
And then you'll say, okay, I'm noticing right now that I'm, putting the barrier in the learner. Let me figure out a way to shift. But sometimes you just need to get it out.
So
and
true.
recognize what you've done, recognize it and say, let me reframe this.
Yeah.
Let's just take a moment to reframe this. And if you're working with colleagues, you don't want to be, policing their language. That will get you many annoying points. But instead we can say, oh yeah, students seem unmotivated. Okay, is there a way that we can frame that so that we can maybe do something about that? Is there a way that we can frame that so that we as the educators have more agency that we can design so that maybe the student can then be able to fully achieve? And so it's just a practice of a common sentence starter I use is there a way that we can reframe that? Or is there another way that we can look at that, can reconsider?
It's like shifting your focus, right? Away from the student to, okay, what can we do about that?
What can we do about that? What can we change in the environment, the lesson design, etc.? So we're going to do that process specifically. We're going to apply the UDL design process, setting clear goals, anticipating barriers, embracing variability, and designing options. And I think we've shared this process previously, but just in case you may be new to the series, and it's also worth repeating, at Lessoncast, this is the design process that we use to apply UDL. And many folks may be familiar with some of these steps, but not all of these steps. We always begin with setting clear goals, clarifying what the goals are. The two middle steps can actually go in either order. And if you've used our design canvas, we tend to start with variability and then barriers, but you can go in either order. But the reason why we have this step of embrace variability, because sometimes folks just go straight to anticipate barriers, design options. We have them as two separate steps to help folks not conflate the two, so that we as educators don't think of variability as the barrier itself. That's why we have it as 4 separate steps. And it's setting goals, anticipating barriers, embracing variability that then guide us to say, which guideline might provide a window of opportunity to help me think about designing options? And so that's the process that we're going to do. And we're going to apply it to classroom routines that support student participation. Anything else, Sylvia, before we jump into applying this design process?
I'm excited to get in. Let's do it.
Let's talk about this. Oh, and there was actually one note I wanted to lift up in the chat. Yes, that in a lot of this, when we think about student participation, somebody mentioned it requires getting to know your students about what makes them each feel comfortable. And there's so much that can come from observing our students, but also asking them, finding ways to ask them in a way that allows them to share what would help them feel more comfortable is a great way to think about how can we co-design with them. Because sometimes we're like, what would my students like? And the students are right there. Right. So we can find out, we can accelerate this process. All right. Because I've even worked with students where I'm like, what was the barrier to getting your homework done? They were like, well, I didn't feel like I needed to do it. Okay, I can work with this. I didn't, but I'm imagining there's all these other reasons why, Okay, so let's focus on one classroom routine in particular, right? So part of really building a UDL habit is getting specific. So let's focus on a very common routine, checking for understanding. Something we do, hopefully, in every classroom multiple times. This routine of checking for student understanding. And I'll just go ahead and describe the image that I have here, because this is one that I've shown on previous slides, and it's important to describe this image. A lot of our images are decorative. This one I wanted to describe. So again, we have a classroom of students. The teacher is standing at the board, asking a question. The students are raising the hand, and then the teacher is calling on a student. With that image in mind, or with the image of other classrooms, let me ask, Sylvia and I are asking you this question. What are the most common methods for checking for student understanding? What are the most common ones that you've observed? And feel free to add in the chat. Yeah, so we see a lot of hand raising, cold calling, exit tickets.
Couple turn and talks.
Turn and talks, think, pair, share.
Fist of 5, thumbs up or down. Ooh, that cold calling just gave me the chills.
All right, so these are some common methods. Yeah, focusing on who knows the answer, yay! You only know what one student knows.
And then you see this dialogue happening, right, between this one student and the teacher.
Yeah, so with those in mind, let's think about some of these common ways and how flexible are they? Right? Some of these common methods honor variability more than others. You can have some flexibility with some of them. They're all not a zero sum. Like there's some that are more flexible than others, right? And it's interesting to me because every time I see the whole thumbs up, thumbs down, whenever I see ask, okay, does everybody get it? Thumbs up, thumbs down. I see so many students who are definitely confused with their thumb up. And then even when they put their thumb down, it's like, there's really no response to what is happening. So let's take this design process to see how we can think flexibly about our checks for student understanding, Okay, so step 1 is to clarify the goals. And we want to be clear on the goal, flexible in the means, right? We're going to be clear on the goal, flexible in the means. So my question to you is, in this moment, when we're checking for student understanding, what is the learning goal? Like, why are we doing this? What is the purpose? I'm going to be quiet and let's see what you all think. It can depend on the subject of the lesson, but just in general, like, why do we check for student understanding? Like, why do we do that? What is our purpose?
Yeah, a lot of you are mentioning this notion of feedback. Are the students getting it? Do we need to revisit? Someone said to know what to teach tomorrow, right? Yeah. Yeah, to know where to go next.
Yeah, in the most basic sense, it's to know what students know. Because if they're not learning, we're actually not teaching. It's not teaching if they're not learning. So we have to know what the students know. And guess what? They need to know what they know. Right? It's also feedback for them. So we're checking for student understanding to know what students know, so that they know what students know and can apply it. As many of you said, apply it to future learning. And as the instructor, we can apply it to future teaching. Sometimes I feel like we keep teaching things that they know already because of the limited options we have for them to show us what they know. So if we're clear that our goal is to know what students know, and that's just a simplified version of it, right? There's other ways we can say it, but it's to know what students know. Then as we go through this process, we're asking, how can there be flexibility in achieving that goal? How can there be flexibility in a way that honors variability and knowing what students know? So then the second step is to anticipate barriers. If we want to know what students know, what might be a barrier to that? And we're remembering that barriers are in the environment, not the learner. Well, in the interest of time, we're going to give you some examples. Okay, so here's a way of framing anticipating barriers that you might find helpful. We ask ourselves, what might prevent students from achieving this goal? Or what might prevent us from achieving this goal of knowing what they know? And a sentence starter is, actually, Sylvie, do you want to walk us through the sentence framing that we can use?
Yeah, actually, a lot of you were using this language already when you were participating in the chat, which was so great. So I want to elevate it and just highlight, when there's only one way to do something, chances are there's going to be a barrier, right? When there's only one way that's outlined, and typically it's the way that we view as most prestigious or most academic. Maybe not, maybe you're trying to be creative and you want every student to do it this one way. But if you think about, if you frame it in that way, you can use this sentence starter to say the requirement to blank, in this case, maybe it's raise hands, as the only way to whatever the goal is, show what they know. Oh, so to know what they know is a barrier, right? So if you have that language of the only way or the requirement to, chances are there's going to be a barrier underneath there. So that's just one kind of cue you can give yourself, and to think, is there only one way to reach this goal?
Yes, and so one potential barrier is raising hands is the only way to do that. Another potential barrier that often comes with checking for student understanding might just be time. It might be the way that we use time, that, there's a limited amount of time for students to, where we prioritize how fast you can do it. So if you aren't able to do it quickly, then the takeaway is the student doesn't know. So that's an example. Okay. And we're going to talk about some options in a moment. We're just walking through the process. So then the third step is to embrace variability and to note that learner variability depends on context. And this is a reminder that learner variability is dynamic, it's ever-changing, it's a mix of strengths and challenges that makes up each learner, right? It also includes different ways in which we identify ability, disability, all of that is part of learner variability. And so as we think about embracing learner variability with this particular goal in mind to know what students know, we want to think about, well, what are learner strengths? What are their challenges? What are their differences in relation to the goal? One common difference, right? Because we have different people in the classroom, a difference that we know is going to be true is processing speed. Students are going to differ in terms of how fast they process information. Some students will process information faster if they receive it in an auditory fashion. Some might process it faster if they're able to read it. Some may process faster if they're able to solve a puzzle. But either way, they're still going to just vary in terms of how long it takes them. I experienced this firsthand when if I heard it on an auditory, I could process it so fast. Like I'd process super fast. And then after I went through chemotherapy treatment, I like distinctly remember being like, oh, this is taking me a long time to process information and to find my words. Like I would just say, I need more time to answer your question. I just became more comfortable with saying, I need more time to answer your question. It'll come. I need more time. And I know for a fact that I'm not less intelligent. I probably know more things than I did 5 years ago. But I change in terms of the time needed to process information. And so if we think about how learners need more time, some are just going to need more time to process. And that's where it's important to emphasize that a difference does not equal a deficit. Even though I can say, man, I wish I used to process faster, I still don't view it as a deficit. I still say, you know what, I needed to slow down sometimes. It's just a difference. It's just, if I lament about it, who's that helping? Nobody.
No, and I just want to elevate what Sammy wrote in the chat too, around this being sort of an interesting conversation to have in connection to new teachers or teachers, in-service teachers who are learning about accelerating students or remediating students, and kind of categorizing students into these two groups of either needing to push ahead and go faster or needing remediation. And it might be a question of really, well, what are the different ways that students can show what they know? And if it's only one way, perhaps we're not giving that opportunity for students to really demonstrate their full strengths and variability. Yeah, there's also the variability, the contextual variability of, like, I was gonna say, Janelle, I'm like, my processing speed goes way down if I have not had coffee in the morning or a good breakfast, right? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so as we think about these different aspects of variability, right? And because remember, variability can change even within an individual, from day to day, from context to context. Then we can, and knowing that variability is the thing that happens, then we can say, all right, what might be some relevant options to consider for this routine of student participation? And we can consider scaffold supports or even challenge opportunities that may be essential for some learners and make them options available to all. And as we go through this design process, rather than become overwhelmed with the entire UDL framework, we're going to focus on individual guidelines. And so for our conversation, as we think about student participation, we're going to focus on first the guideline of interaction, then we're taking a look at the guideline for expression and communication, and then the guideline for strategy development. And we're going to talk about some of the changes with the 3.0 update. Now, for this one routine, you could just focus on options for interaction. I like to say focus on one thing at a time. If we try to do too many things, we can become overwhelmed and end up doing nothing. So if we were just going to take a deep dive into this guideline for interaction, first let's talk about it. Because prior to the 3.0 update, the guideline used to say design options for physical action. Design options for physical action, because it really had more of a clinical mindset to it. And with this update, what we wanted to highlight is that what we really focused on are options for interaction, because all learning is an interaction between the learner and their environment, whether it's interacting with the teacher, with their peers, or with the content. And so as we're thinking about options for interaction, we consider how do we vary, and look at this word, it's right there in the updated guideline, vary and honor the methods for response, navigation, and movement. I am not less of a learner because I need a different method of response. And then the second bullet here is around optimizing access to access. And this one's a little bit of a tongue twister, but each of those words are very important. Optimize access to accessible materials. Okay, so when we think about accessible materials, if you're not familiar with the AIM Center, AEM Center, and they call like the POUR principles, POUR principles. These are principles to help us make sure that we're offering accessible, primarily digital materials, right? So it's accessible materials, assistive technologies, and accessible technologies and tools. So a lot of our tools like phones have accessible technologies built into them. And so that's why it may seem like a little bit of a tongue twister, but each word was intentional. And I think it's important for this group to understand that. And if you have a question about it, go ahead and put it in the Q&A or the chat, however we're doing it, because we will have time for Q&A. But that's an important distinction there. And so if we think about, there's a whole lot in guideline 4, even though it only has 2 considerations. And these examples that we're highlighting, most of these examples come straight from the UDL Design Canvas. So in our session materials, there is a link to the UDL Design Canvas 3.0, and you can dive into it by clicking on interaction, and you'll get to concrete examples and tools for every single guideline and consideration. And so these are lifted up from there. And so examples include augmentative and alternative communication devices. Having those tools will be available, and not just available, that when students need to use those tools, that they're not stigmatized for needing more time, that tool is not seen as less than, and that as a community, we care for how we interact with one another. It also includes accessibility features, whether it's on devices like smartphones or in tools like, Google Classroom has some accessibility features. Text-to-speech software, even the incorporation of visuals or graphics can support interaction. Icons, emojis can support interaction. And here's one that I'm going to hold up here. I use these sometimes pinch cards. So this idea of every student raises their hand, like a teacher asks a question, and then students raise their hand and teacher calls on one. We use these pinch cards where they say one side says A, B, C, D, and the other side says 1, 2, 3, 4. And so if the teacher asked a question and it was more of a multiple choice in nature, the student could pinch which one they thought it was, and sometimes they're open-ended. And that's a way for every student to respond in that moment, rather than just having one student at a time. You can also do it with a true, false, agree, disagree. It's false, or agree, disagree, right? These are just other ways where you're getting a sense of everyone in that moment. And then you can say, all right, everybody who agrees, find somebody who disagrees and have a conversation, convince the other person, right? And now the students are interacting rather than it just being the teacher and the students. Yes, whiteboards. Yes, exactly. Whiteboards. Thank you. Yes, and thank you for answering AIM in the chat for us.
Yeah, whiteboards are so simple, low tech, along with the pinch cards. Just really, I've seen it open up so many doors for students, just grabbing those small whiteboards.
Yeah. And after I got tired of my whiteboards breaking, I just laminated a white piece of paper.
That works too.
Yeah. Or sometimes people put them in sleeves, but I just laminated. And so one takeaway question for us to consider is, what options might offer more equitable learner interactions? We can always pause, and this can be a question that we iterate on all year. And is there a co-design opportunity? Is there a way to ask the students and learn from them, what would have helped you participate more fully in this class, in this lesson? Sylvia, anything else you want to add about this one? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yes. Sign language responses.
I mean, I just love these questions that you're framing for us, Nicole, that we can pose to our learners, because they're so simple, and yet they can garner such helpful information for us as designers, to make sure that everyone is gaining access to the content and has a way to show what they know. Yeah.
And what I love to do is I love to ask students who I feel like we could have done a little bit better for them, ask them what would have helped you. But I like to talk to students that seem like they're, ahead of the game a bit and say, well, what is helping you?
Yes.
Sometimes they have some things that they're doing on the side that are actually beneficial for others to learn about. They have strategies.
Mhm.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. Oh, I love that.
That's a
Bathroom
good tip.
laminate. That is a new one. I'm going to go check that out. You need some bathroom lemonade. I might use that.
Thank you for the tip.
Yes. Okay. So if we move down the UDL, so when I have time for questions, if we move down this principle of action and expression to now guideline 5, expression and communication. There are some changes, some updates here that we're going to highlight. But I wanted to lift up, some tools, some concrete strategies we can use if we're just focusing on the routine of students participating, right? We're just focused on students participating. Here are some options: video or voice record. I had a student, over the years, I've had several students, one in particular with Tourette's, and we wanted that student to still fully participate, but they had in advance, here are some questions that we're going to have, and they were able to record their responses in advance. Using sentence starter, sentence frames is a support that could help with participation. Even using physical manipulatives, graphic organizers like story webs or mapping or outlining. But this is where I have to say this. This is very important. I might have said it earlier in the series, but I have to say it here. When we think about tools like this for expression and communication, these are tools, not rules. I'll give 2 examples. I have my nephew, his teacher was focused on a strategy called visual listening. So student participation, she wanted all the students to practice visual listening. Visual listening is supposed to be applied as a tool, not a rule. So the students were presenting, and my nephew, instead of looking at the presenter, was looking down, apparently he said, at a book bag with the number 18 on it. He's an artist. He's very descriptive. And the teacher apparently said, look at the speaker, look at the speaker. And he didn't look at the speaker. He was listening to the speaker. He wasn't listening to her say, listen to the speaker. And she kicked him out of the classroom. And I'm like, okay, the goal was to listen to the speaker. So I don't know what listening he's doing from outside of the classroom. But her logic was, I wanted him to practice visual listening. That's not a strategy for him. It is supposed to be a tool, not a rule. So sometimes we get these options and we say, oh, let's everybody do it. So that's why we've moved from the core idea. I used to say essential for some, beneficial for all. We've made a shift to really say essential for some, available to all, because it still should be an option, a choice, a tool, not a rule. Another example I'll give is outlining. Outline is a strategy. It often happens in a lot of AVID classes. Working with my daughter, she's very organized in her thinking. She's working on an essay. She's getting points taken off because she's not using the traditional outlining. I'm asking the teacher, what is the goal of this? Well, to organize their thoughts. Her thoughts are very well organized. It's in preparation for her essay. Her essay is great. But now she's focusing on all of the minutia of the Roman letters and the indentation, and that's not the goal. Again, we're confusing rigor with rigor mortis. These are tools, not rules. Okay, so they're an option that we can expose students to, but you have to remember, what is the actual goal there?
And Nicole, I'll just say, I know I've done this as a teacher before. Well, I'll find a new outlining, resource, or this great new strategy that has a lot of research behind it. I bust into the classroom and I say, all right, kids, this is what we're going to do. Everyone's going to try this out because there's so much research behind it. It's a hot off the press. It's really, really great. Let's everybody do it. The challenge became then that it didn't work for everybody, right? It didn't. Even if it had lots of great research behind it and, you know, lots of buzz, because the fact of the matter was, I was still only providing one way to do something. And when it's the only way, and that thus a rule, it's not going to work for everybody. And that example of your daughter breaks my heart, Nicole, because I think, you know, the drive for compliance and to make sure that she is complying with these letter systems and outlining exactly the way her teacher wants is just sucking, to me, the joy of learning to write an essay.
It's just that so much cognitive energy is going to the wrong thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Another way to think about this is this particular guideline. And one of the considerations, which is there's some massaging to the language. It was there before, but the language has been adjusted a bit, is around building fluencies with graduated support. Right? This idea of building fluency with graduated support. And so when we think about student participation, building fluencies with graduated support, Sylvia, I don't know about you, but I have seen quite a bit of over scaffolding. Again, it's when everybody, it's an example of every student at the same time is filling in the same worksheet. We're all doing it together. It is over scaffolded. Only person thinking is the teacher. And right.
Yep.
And so when we think about, we don't want to confuse graduated support with over scaffolding. So how do you know if you're over scaffolding? Here are some questions to ask. Is it safe to fail and learn from mistakes? If everybody is able to get the answer right on the first try, we have probably over scaffolded. Right? So students should be trying and learning from mistakes. Is it safe to fail and learn from mistakes? And this acronym FAIL, I can't claim it. It's from a skateboarder who did a TED Talk. But FAIL, in this case, stands for first attempt in learning. We shouldn't expect students to get it the first time. Great if they do, right? But then I question, did they already know it? Right? So we want it to be safe to fail and learn from mistakes. Another sign that we may be over scaffolding is we have to ask ourselves, are there opportunities to apply feedback? And kind of hand in hand, are there opportunities for revision? That's how you know that it's not over scaffolded. There's a sense of building fluency with graduated support. I tried it. Okay, I'm getting feedback. I'm going to apply it. Thoughts on this one, Sylvia?
Yeah, I just think of, I know many folks are familiar with Zaretta Hammond's work and, you know, culturally responsive teaching in the brain. And she has this great graphic of a learning pit where the idea is that we want learners to really get into that space where there's productive struggle. They're grappling with new ideas and new skills. And it's not a clean, you know, okay, I get it right away and I've mastered it and move on. But there really is an opportunity to kind of get a little bit messy with the learning. And I know she told you personally that how we know that something is rigorous, the measure for whether we know that a task is rigorous is if there's an opportunity for revision. So I think that just speaks so beautifully to what you're saying. And I love this acronym of FAIL. I'm going to borrow that.
Yes, and I love this idea of, you know, helping students try things. Like, so we can expose them to, like here, Sarah's mentioning templates, make them available as templates, but then also show them how you can make your own templates. And it's available. It's a tool, not a rule. And we're helping them think about, when would this be helpful for me? Right? We have to build in that. We could probably add to this list opportunities for reflection. Really, it's really this idea of, can we show progress? Right? Are we aiming for progress? Are we aiming for perfection? All right. One other thing related to this guideline, I'm a little bit over, but we're going to keep going. That's the good stuff I want to make sure we do. There's so many things we wanted to share on our last day. Okay, so another consideration that is new with the 3.0 update is addressing biases related to modes of expression and communication. Bias and it can relate to, we have a bias where we prefer things that are done faster, or we have a bias to written assignments. Written assignments are seen as more academic. And we could spend a whole long session on this. But really, one way to examine to what extent we have bias as it relates to modes of expression and communication. A few simple questions we can ask ourselves. Are we designing for ourselves? Left to my own devices, without being mindful of my own biases, I will design the best lesson for me. I'm one of those people where, like, you know, the saying, dance like nobody's watching. I'm like, why would I do that? I want everybody to see. I'm gonna design for expression and communication where I'm dancing on a stage. That's for me. Right? So I have to be, am I designing for myself? Another question to ask, are we designing based on the ways we've always assessed learning? Sometimes we do things just out of habit. And then are we designing according to what's comfortable or familiar for the teacher, not what's comfortable or accessible for the learner? So these are just some questions to ask, and then say, are there opportunities for flexibility? All right, and we have so much more of this. We'll talk about future professional learning opportunities. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about. There's literally a whole module we can talk about. All right, so let's just talk about this last guideline here under action and expression. Designing options for strategy development. Designing options for strategy development. Strategy development, I like to say, is planning your work and working your plan. Right? Planning your work and working plan. So some concrete options, we can model goal setting. Right? We can model the process of, here's my goal. Here's how I think I can get there. Here are some steps so we can break it down. Here's why my goal is important to me. We can model that. We can do think alouds. Involve students in the IEP process. And then one I really want to highlight, that it's a resource in the, if you go to the UDL Canvas, the UDL 3.0 Canvas, and you go to strategy development, and if you scroll down to anticipate and plan for challenges, there is an article about flexible due dates. I encourage everyone, especially my secondary teachers, to strongly consider flexible due dates. And the article explains how flexible due dates actually does more to teach students about responsibility than if you're late, I'm taking 10 points off for every day you're late. That's actually not a realistic way when we think about the real world. Even when it comes to taxes, you can apply for an extension. And it's not like a week, it's like 6 months. Right? And so if we really want to teach responsibility, we can think about how is there flexibility? Yeah, how is there flexibility in our due dates? And what I love about that article for flexible due dates, it explains it's not a free-for-all. It's not turn anything in wherever. I know for me personally, if I don't have a due date, it's not getting done. I don't know. I've learned this about myself. Right? And so it's not about just having to be open-ended, but the strategic ways where students can have some flexibility. And even things like with strategy development, opportunities for peer feedback helps them monitor their own progress. If I can give feedback to somebody else, and we have some feedback tools in your materials, if I can give feedback to somebody else, I'm going to be better about examining my own work. And here, there's one new consideration in this guideline here. Challenge exclusionary practices. Challenge exclusionary practices. And here's an example of how we challenge exclusionary practices. You might not have thought about this. This might be new. Or if you've heard me before, you're like, oh yeah, here she goes. An exclusionary practice is when we weaponize time. We talked about how sometimes we need more time. A lot of times in school, we are actually weaponizing time. And here's an example. Why are so many of our tests timed? Rarely does how fast you do it mean you know it better. Right? Is that because I do it fast doesn't equate to I know it better. And so students will have the extension of, extended time. But really, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, why are these test time? And a lot of colleges in particular, higher ed places are moving away from time tests. Unless it's essential to actually being able to do a thing, we don't need to have time be a barrier in many cases because it's not necessarily aligned to the learning goal. And I do work with medical schools, and they're looking at how they have prioritized speed over care. And so think about, does this test need to be timed? Do we need inflexible deadlines? The word deadline actually came from, there was a line that if you were a prisoner and you crossed it, you got shot. Maybe we should look at this as like a due date. Not a deadline, but a due date. If you're expecting a child, the child might come a little early, child might come a little late, but you better be ready when the child comes. It's a due date, right? So there's a little more flexibility there. The child comes when the child's ready, or for other circumstances. And then this idea that speed equals better or smarter. And if I'm not fast, then I feel like I don't belong, or I'm not as worthy, or I'm not as able. And so there are other examples too, but the ways in which we apply time often exclude rather than include. So that's something to consider. And so a takeaway question that I encourage you to think about. Yeah, sorry, I'm lost in the chat. Yes. Oh, thank you for putting that in there. Yes. And oftentimes that speed is a prerequisite for being on an accelerated track, literally accelerated track, an AP track, an honors track is how fast you can do it. Yep. And we could go into it, but it's really steeped in some actually negative history. This idea of faster is better. It's a factory model. It's a model where we actually don't want students to be critical thinkers.
Not to slow down and think about it.
Don't slow down and think about it because I'm telling you what to do. I want you to be fast and productive. Right? And so one takeaway question to think about is, how might flexible thinking regarding time honor variability? Right? How can we honor variability in just thinking a little more flexibly regarding time? We really set ourselves up for failure thinking that everybody is supposed to learn the same thing within the same time frame at the same rate. That is impossible because they're different human beings. I might need to spend more time on this and less time on that. So what are some opportunity areas to consider? And to consider that honoring variability fosters belonging. To consider variability as a problem or a deficit is to tell students you don't belong here. And so that's why this is so important. So we went through a lot of tools, but they can all be found on the UDL design canvas. Well, if you go to the canvas and then you use the hyperlinks to get to our larger document where we have lots of strategies and resources. We also have linked within there, linked within the session guidebook, some self-paced professional learning opportunities. You're invited to join the jumpstartpd.com website. It's free membership if you want to continue this conversation, because today's the last one. And then we have some self-paced ones where if you are like, well, I need to understand a little bit more about bias as it relates to expression and communication. I need to understand a little bit more about that. Then I recommend this Understanding UDL 3.0 concepts. If you want to understand representation, what does it mean to be authentic a little bit more deeply, that is for you. But if you're like, you know what, I just want a little more guidance in applying UDL to my everyday lessons, then that's the resource for you. And we take you through the core ideas, lesson planning, and each and every UDL guideline and consideration. And then we're about to get to Q&A. This is your challenge. Identify a routine in your classroom and examine it for potential biases related to expression and communication. Is it the way we've always done things? Is there only one way to express and communicate? So And try to pick something where you're like, okay, I could use some work on this. I could use some work on this. And so as you go through this challenge, you're going to ask yourself, for this routine, is there a clear goal? What are learner strengths and challenges and differences in relation to the goal? What are some potential barriers? And what are opportunities that guidelines can offer? And just pick one guideline and explore it for a little bit. And then Sylvia, why don't you go ahead and explain this phrase and how it relates to honoring variability?
Oh my gosh, yes. So some of you might be familiar with this expression or have personal connection to it, but I came across this quote online that is from the Maori tribe. And I'll be honest, I've only read it. I've not heard it pronounced out loud. So it's on the screen and I don't want to offend anyone by trying to say it out loud. But it's this expression that the Maori people use to describe autism. And what it means is in their own time and space. And I love that idea of reframing this, what we perceive as maybe a deficit, but really reframing it as another form of variability and honoring that everyone has a way to navigate their world in which they go through it in their own time and in their own space. And if we're thinking about honoring variability and seeing that everybody has an opportunity when we're removing these pressures, these barriers of speed and only one way to participate and having to be verbal, we can really embrace this idea that no, let's just give everyone the opportunity to go about learning at their own time and in their own space.
Yes. Thank you. And yes, we wanted to go ahead and we know we have questions and just thank you for, we know we had a little extended content, but there was so much we wanted to share because every other time we've been like, oh, we could do that later. We could do that later.
It's the last
But
one.
we also want to honor your questions too. We want to
Yes.
honor your questions.
Yes.
This was perfect. I know we have one person with their hand raised, but perhaps we can provide a moment for the rest of the group to add any questions that have surfaced for them so that we can jump into our Q&A. So Susanna, you can go ahead and unmute yourself if you're ready to ask your question.
Or if that was an accident, feel free to let us know in the chat.
It happens.
I'm assuming that was an accident and we're not seeing any other questions come in from today's session.
And here can I, well, while we're waiting on questions, yes. And so, we're giving extra wait time. And I just want to appreciate, Chrissy mentioned in the chat, like, needing to work on this idea of time variability. And this is, it is an ongoing process, right? And time is how we spend our time is a huge shift. I think that with the pandemic, there were some opportunities that we kind of went backwards after we came back. Where if we can think about what's really important, what's really critical, that is an opportunity.
Yeah, I'll only echo to say, Chrissy, like this is in the larger cultural waters, that this idea of, you've heard the expression time is money, right? There's this emphasis on doing things with haste and getting it done quickly. So we're bumping up against a lot of norms and cultural values. And I think you'll see that when we're aware of that and we intentionally kind of slow down the benefits that we see for ourselves and our students is really worth it.
I don't see any questions in the chat, and so I am going to close us out if that's okay.
Yes.
So
Oh, so
it's
many
so
great things to chat.
yeah, so it's so bittersweet for things to come to an for the series to come to an end. But I just want to thank you for joining us for this session, this final session in the series on action and expression that honors variability. Thank you to our amazing presenters. This has been truly an amazing webinar series. Like I said before, I'm so sad this is our last session together, but the work doesn't end. It continues through you all and what you do in your classrooms. I also want to thank all of our attendees for choosing to attend this webinar series and just elevating our chat. We appreciate you spending this time with us. We will post the recording for this session on the Padlet, and you can find the certificate of completion for sessions 1 through 4 on the Padlet as well. I know my teammates are dropping links in the chat. Please take a few minutes to complete our end of series survey and provide us some feedback. We really want some feedback so we can make future SIP events even better. I don't know how we're going to top this webinar series, but we have some additional events coming up next year in 2025. So you can use the QR code. I don't know if you're sharing your screen yet.
Oh, let me go back to that. Sorry. No, I
No
got
worries.
somebody asked a very specific question in the chat, and I was like, email us at info@lessoncast.com because we do have information about that. It's just a very specific question.
Oh, no worries. But
okay.
our teammates will drop the link to the survey in the chat as well. And so thank you everyone for joining us again for this series. Yes, the QR code is in front of you. Please give us some feedback. You'll get a reminder email tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of your evening, everyone. With grace and gratitude from the SIP team, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you spending this time with us.
Thank you, Nicole and Sylvia. And Nicole, you're responding to Sammy's question, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay,
We
perfect.
do have thoughts about dual language and applying UDL. Yes.
Great. Okay.
Thank you all so much.
And then team, can we make sure to drop the Padlet link in the chat again? I see a question. How do we access the Padlet? The Padlet link will be in the chat right here. There you go. So you can just go ahead and click on that and access all of the resources there.
And huge thank you to the whole SIP team for helping make this possible. You got the lovely folks on screen, and then also just an amazing team off screen, jumping in the chat, orchestrating orchestrating sort of some of the behind the scenes features. Really, you all just ran this so smoothly. So thank you so much.
Yes, and kudos to you all for cultivating this community. Hundreds of educators coming after school consistently for 4 sessions. That's awesome. Thank you.
Well, thank you to our community because we would not be here without our community. So much appreciation for our team and our grantees and all of the educators across California who are just so in it. They're in it. It's really, they inspire us. Yeah. All right, everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Have a good evening,
Bye.
everyone.